Hello guys and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the World Juniors and making my final predictions for the gold, the silver, the bronze, and every team, every country involved. At this year's World Juniors, we're going to be seeing so much talent like Axel Sandin-Pellikka, Gavin, McKenna, James Hagens, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Every team has something to offer and it's going to be a pretty close one this year. But who do I see being the standout players? Who do I see winning every single game? And who do I see ultimately winning the gold medal this year at the World Juniors? Well, make sure you watch till the end because we're going to be predicting everything from the MVP to the gold medal game, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey prospect talk just like this all throughout the year. Now, as you guys can see, I'm here at the old setup here for the next couple of weeks for the holidays. The setup is a work in progress, so keep that in mind. Bear with me, please. But let's get into the World Junior talk for this year because this tournament is going to be so interesting. Last year, we saw the US rise and win the gold medal, but this year, I think it could go in so many different directions. Honestly, there are maybe upwards to 4, maybe even 5 teams that I could see potentially winning the gold medal this year and having a solid chance. Now, looking at what we saw last year, we saw some pretty big surprises, most notably, of course, with Canada losing in the quarterfinal to Czechia. They would ultimately go on to the bronze medal game and win against Finland 8-5 in an absolute war there. But we ultimately saw the US winning their gold medal 6-2 versus Sweden. This year, just like last year, though, I think we're going to see a pretty even spread. And just like last year, a little bit of a spoiler here, I think Czechia is going to be an interesting one. They've kind of built this brand for themselves of this resilient, hard to play against hockey, especially recently. And enough of the preview, though. Let's get straight into it. Now, starting us off on the predictions here with Group A, we're going to go on to, in my opinion, the worst team in the group, and that is, unfortunately, Germany. And they have a couple options that I think could be interesting, but I think most likely they're going to end up with a 0-0-0-4 record. In terms of the 4 group, to me, the one that's the most interesting is David Lewandowski, who's a draft eligible this year, playing in the Saskatoon Blades. He's on the younger side, not even 18 years old yet, but so far with Saskatoon this year has 15 points in 20 games. The options for Germany forward-wise are pretty rough, but I do think defensively they're going to have a couple interesting ones. You also got Carlos Handel, who is also a draft eligible, playing in the QMJHL this year, 11 points in 28 games of Halifax this year, but you also got Norman Panoka, really one of the only bright spots on this German roster, a draft pick of the Sabres back in the 7th round in 2023. He's been hopping between the QMJHL, the WHL, the USHL over the last couple of years, but he's somebody that can provide some good physical size, good physical traits, and Germany's really going to be leading on these guys that are unproven but have big sizes to them to try to alleviate some of the weaknesses throughout the roster. But considering the goaltending issues, the lack of really any offensive superstars, I don't see Germany having the most successful tournament, sadly. They have a couple interesting players, but that does not make a team, and ultimately I think they'll finish with 0 points in the tourney and be sent to the relegation round. Now we move on to number 4 in the group, and to me this is where Latvia will go. The only reason they're 4th instead of 5th is because I think they will beat Germany when they eventually face each other. Besides that, I don't see there being too much success. You do got Eric Matejko, who's really going to be the big scorer on this team if there is any. 6 foot, 209-pound forward, who of course was drafted in the 3rd round by the Caps in last year's draft. He's somebody that has a fine QMJHL score, but especially that goal scoring is going to be relied upon. He is going to need to really carry the load. I'm not sure if he's that type of player, but he's going to have that expectation. Defensively, I think they have a couple interesting options. Pateras Bulans, and sorry for my pronunciations on some of these guys as well, just putting that out there. It's going to be rough. He's somebody that's been pretty solid in the QMJHL the past couple of years. Hasn't been drafted, but has put up some good numbers. You also have a draftee in Daryl Oljenskis, who is a 7th rounder by the Ducks in last year's draft. He's somebody that also at 18 years old is probably going to be playing a pretty big role playing in the junior 20 this year. Goaltending wise, you got Axel Ozals, who is a factor, probably is going to be the starter, but we'll end up seeing on that. He's somebody that has put up some pretty good numbers in the men's league in Latvia, a 922 save percentage in 11 games. I don't see Latvia being all too competitive, but hopefully they can keep these games close at the very least and avoid relegation in the end. Now going on to 3rd in Group A, this is where I see Finland finishing off. I do see them getting wins versus Latvia and Germany, but losing to the US and Canada, which we'll get into, of course. But I do think the Finns have some decent options. I don't think it's going to be the best group for them whatsoever, but they're still, especially on the 4 group, I think have some good weapons. You're going to have Konsta Helenius there as I think a pretty big scorer there, but you're also going to have Kasper Holton as a big goal scorer. You're going to have Emil Hemming, who was drafted as well in the 1st round from this last draft. Rasmus Kumpalainen is somebody that has taken some big next steps, especially in the Liga this year. On the defense, Jesse Pulkkinen is probably going to be the most interesting one to look out for. He's somebody that I think could potentially be on the roster. We'll have to wait and see on him. I think he is eligible. He turns 20 on December 27th, so I think he just is able to make it, but he would be a lot of fun there. On the goaltending side, it's all over the place. They could go for some more, some older players, but I do hope that Emil Vitti is there. He hasn't played too much this season, but in the U20 U20 level is still had to put up some pretty good numbers there. He's somebody that, though, especially with the lack of games this year, I could see Finland going in a different direction. Still, they're going to be competitive. They're going to be feisty. We'll see if they have enough talent to put themselves over the top, though, especially when we get to past the prelims and into the actual tourney itself. Now, coming in at number 2, of course, this is where my US, I think, are going to land. It all depends, I think, on that US-Canada game and the result from that. For the Canadians, I think they'll go to overtime, and I think they will win it, which you'll see in my standings predictions for number 1 does affect it quite a bit, where the US finishing at 10 points. We'll get into Canada in a second, but for the US, they still have a very strong roster. I don't think quite as dangerous as they were last year, especially defensively, but still some amazing options. You look at the offense, you got James Hagens, of course, and you're going to have him over Ryan Leonard and Gabe Perreault, a monster line there. Unfortunately for the US, it doesn't seem like Will Smith is going to be called back, which I think for how well he's been playing for the Sharks is something there, and as well as his injury, I just don't think that's going to be so have to work with what they get. Outside of that, you still have great options like Cole Eisman, Oliver Moore, and even players on top of that like Trevor Connolly and Teddy Stiga coming out of the NCAA that have a lot of offensive talent. Defensively, I think there is a little bit of an issue of pop. I think Z Buem, when we look at him, he is going to be controlling that whole defense with the power play and the puck movement. Outside of that, they don't have a ton of guys who I think play up that lane, but you do have players like EJ Emery and Drew Fortescue from last year's World Junior team that bring some really strong defensive habits. And I think the team defensively will be pretty strong from the back end, though I think the offensive pop just isn't quite as dangerous as it was last year. But for the goaltending, I think it's going to make up for it because Trey Augustine is coming in as the best goaltender in this tournament, bar none. I mean, you have a few good options outside of him, but Augustine is looked at as the favorite for the best goaltender of the tournament, as he should be. He has just been dominant in the NCAA, having another great season with Michigan State this year in his sophomore season, getting a .934 save percentage. He was great at the World Juniors last year, and that should likely continue on to this season. No matter if the US win gold or not, Augustine being good is about as good of a bet as you could possibly make. Now, before we get into number 1, I first want to mention today's sponsor, BetUS. Just use code YouTube150 and you'll get a 150% sign-up bonus on your first deposit and 125% sign-up bonus on your next 2 deposits after that. If you're looking to make picks for this hockey season, BetUS is the place to do so. Not just to make picks on the NHL and different awards and everything like that. You can also go through the NHL draft, and when the World Juniors come, you can also make picks on that as well through every single game, every single player. BetUS, for just hockey, for all the sports out there, is the place to make your picks throughout the year, and thank you to BetUS for sponsoring today's video. But now going on to number 1, and to be the best team, at least in the preliminary rounds, will be Team Canada, finishing with a 3-1-0-0 record, 11 points in the prelims, and it's pretty easy to see why. They're going to have a lot more firepower, I think, than they had last year, and a lot of returnees who I think are going to be making an impact. You got players like Callum Ritchie, who I think will be huge for them. You got players like Brian Yeager, Carson Rakoff, Easton Cowan, Barkley Kenton, but I also think Gavin McKenna, which we'll get into when we get into the tournament, and especially for some of the awards, I think is going to be a massive player for this Canadian team, on track to make it already. He's somebody that I think will pretty instantly be in that side of that top 6, and I would not be surprised if he's one of the point leaders for this tournament. He is absolutely ridiculous, leading the WHL in points already as a 16-year-old. He, to me, is going to make a major impact, at least at the junior level. He's already proved so much, and with the World Juniors especially, I think he's going to be ridiculous. But you also look at that defense, and they have a good mix of different guys. Sam Dickinson and Zane Perreault are going to be bringing some of the offense. Hopefully Perreault ends up making it. But you have a lot of more defensive players like Bo Akey and Andrew Gibson. We'll see how effective they end up being. They did leave some players like Carter Yakimchuk, who I don't think I would have left off the roster off of it because of some defensive concerns. We'll see if that lack of punch, though, ends up biting them. But I think having Perreault there especially is going to make it a little bit better. The goaltending is really the biggest question. You have so many different players. You got a player like Scott Raslap, who was on the roster last year, but hasn't really been all that impressive yet. You have players like Carson Bjarnason, who I think maybe are the leading player to be the starter, but you also have Carter George there, who could also factor in too. I mean, depending on who they go for, they'll be okay. I think they'll get the job done, but I think, will they be better than Augustine? Will they be better than what Sweden has to offer? That is the main question there, because I think the goaltending, if there's anything that could sink Canada, it's in net. And now you guys can get a full look at my Group A predictions. Canada 1, USA 2, Finland 3, Latvia 4, and Germany number 5. And now let's get into Group B. Now we're going to go through the Group B predictions a little bit more rapid fire here, because I think it's pretty interesting how close this race could be. Not at the very bottom, because I think Kazakhstan will easily be the worst team in this tournament. I love that they're here. I think it'll be amazing, but I don't think they're going to be putting up much of a chance, sadly. That goes on to Switzerland, where they do have some options, especially on the defense. Players like Leon Mowgli, who will be returning returning. He could factor in, but besides that, I don't think there's much there. You do have a goaltender in Christian Kirsch, who I think will factor in onto the lineup, and he could potentially be the starter. We'll see what ends up happening, but I think Switzerland most likely just gets that win versus Kazakhstan and probably calls it a day. Now you go into the top three, which I think will be incredibly close, especially for the number 2 and number 3 race between Czechia and Slovakia. I can even see a situation where Czechia gets number 1. I think they have a really underrated roster that will grind teams down to a pulp, but I could see them having some troubles in overtime, which is why I see the offenses of teams like Slovakia and Sweden overpowering them if they were to stay close. Even in a team like Slovakia's case, who has a player like Dalibor Dvorsky, who I think can make a difference that I just don't see out of the Czechia roster, at least in the prelims to start out. Though I see it being incredibly close, and that tiebreaker, especially for Slovakia, being that overtime win versus the Czechs, which I think will just put them ahead. Still 8 points, but I think will make things interesting. I think Sweden will still be the number 1 team, though, by far, in terms of play and in terms of points pace, getting 11 points on the tourney and getting that overtime win as well versus the Czechs, I think will be huge for them. In terms of the offense and the defense especially, there's so much to like there. Defensively, players like Axel Sandin-Pellikka, I think, are going to be among the best in this tournament. The big question to me will be how much can they really juice themselves up with their synergy? Are they going to be able to provide a coherent unit offensively? There has been some problems for the Swedes in terms of offense at those big moments over the past couple of years. We'll see if they can turn that tide. I think they have a great chance, though, in this tournament to make some big damage happen, and I hope they do, because I'm always rooting for the Swedes. Now we've gone for the prelim predictions, but now we can get into what you guys have probably been waiting for, the actual quarterfinals and the tournament predictions. Who wins gold, silver, and bronze? We're going to be breaking that down all right here. First, we got to start out with the seeding and what we'll see in the quarterfinal rounds. We first have Canada versus Switzerland, then Sweden versus Latvia, the US versus Czechia, which is going to be one heck of a game, and then also Slovakia versus Finland. Those last 2 games are going to be extremely close, and honestly, I could go either way with both of them. Now, for the results in the quarterfinals, this is what I see happening. Starting out, Canada getting a easy but interesting win versus Switzerland. They don't overly dominate, but I think it'll be a 4-1 win. Still Canada getting their bearings, still developing chemistry, and I think it'll be something where, even though they don't get this insane win, Switzerland keeps it close. I think especially because of their goaltending. I think Canada's still going to be learning a lot of lessons and developing that synergy for the rest of the tournament. You have Sweden winning 6-0 versus Latvia. I think they're just going to have a dominant performance there and really get their feet going there. And then we have the final 2 games, and this is where it really hurts, because I think the Czechs are going to be so sneaky, so resilient, and this is not for the first time that the US have gotten upset by Czechia. I think in a shootout, the Czechs are going to win 2-1 to advance onto the semifinals, leaving the gold medal winner from last year beaten in the quarterfinals. Not the first time that's happened either, but I think this Czechs team is extremely underrated, and even though I think the US wouldn't doubt them, I think some of maybe the issues defensively on that 4 group might come back to hurt them at the wrong moments. Some of the undisciplinedness in players like Trevor Connolly might hurt them as well. We'll see what ends up happening. Maybe the Czechs are going to be a strong team up and down. They won't make many mistakes, and compared to a US team that I think will, there might be some issues there once they meet. Then we have that final game between Slovakia and Finland, where I just see the Finns getting it done. This is mostly just because of some of the offensive talent they have and some of the guys I prefer on that roster just being able to overwhelm Slovakia at the end of it. I see it being a pretty close game, 0-0 right until the 3rd period, but the Finns just being able to get it done and squeaking out a win to advance onto the semis. Now we go on to the semifinals, and if you guys are asking about seeding here, because I think it is pretty interesting, both Canada and Sweden had the same exact record in the preliminaries at a 3-1-0-0 record, which means that if it were to go this way, where both teams find themselves in the semis, it would go down to a tiebreaker. Now, that first tiebreaker is point differential in the preliminary round, which I do think goes to Canada, especially against a team like Germany. I think they're going to be racking up the points like Canada does every single year, it seems like, versus those lower end teams. Sweden, I just don't know, is going to be as dominant as Canada will be against those bottom feeders, which I think gives them the seeding differential and therefore puts them against Finland in that 3A spot in the semis, while the Swedes face Czechia in the semis as well. But now we go into the semifinals and the results here, and starting on the first game, Canada I see will win 5-0 versus Finland. There's no easy opponents in the semifinals, but I think Finland is about as easy of an opponent as you could possibly wish if you're Canada. Maybe Slovakia also would have been an easy one, but this is where seeding matters so much, because compared to Sweden, who has to face Czechia, I think the Canadians between Slovakia and Finland, I think win pretty easily between those two. But then you have, of course, that final game, Czechia, Sweden, and I went back and forth on this I love the Sweden roster. I love what Czechia is capable of, but I just think considering how strong of a unit Czechia might be, I think especially considering that some of that goaltending, Michael Robel could be an interesting one, even though he hasn't had the biggest success this year. I think he's somebody that could provide a big impact. He's somebody that I think will be big. I think that defense will be huge for Czechia, providing such good stability and physicality throughout that game, and I see it being a strangling one, just being so close and so interesting, but I see the Czechs just getting a late goal in this third period being just a ball buster for the Swedes, and ultimately Czechia moving on to the gold medal game to face Canada yet again. But that leads us into the gold medal and bronze medal game, and I would love to hear down below for you guys what your results would be out of these two games. First, we got Canada versus Czechia for gold, and then, of course, a classic matchup, which I just love to see, Sweden versus Finland for that bronze medal. Both of these games would be ridiculously fun, and I would be here for it, even as a US fan. Now, going on to the bronze medal game, and the winner from that, I think it will ultimately be Sweden. I think the Finns have a lot to be proud of, especially with the lack of pure talent, especially defensively coming into the roster, but I think they will put all they can into this game, try to make it as competitive as possible, but Sweden's just going to have too much talent, especially from that forward group, that will overwhelm Finland in the end. Still, though, coming fourth place is solid in this tournament, and especially for the Swedes, getting that bronze medal isn't what they're hoping for, but they did the best they could. But now the moment you guys have been waiting for, the gold medal game, Canada versus Czechia, and this would be another amazing one, just like we saw in the gold medal game back in 2023, and I think it would be back and forth, so much physicality, so much toughness, especially from the Czech side, and so much just crazy moments, so many close calls, so many post shots that make an entire country just go crazy in their heads. I think this will be an amazing game, just like we saw back in 2023. But like that game, I'm going to see a Canadian superstar will Canada to a win. And I think Gavin McKenna, just like Bedard back in 2023, will do that exact same thing. I don't think it'll be an overtime or anything like that. I think it will be a close one. But in regulation, I think Canada is going to win 2-0. And the game-winning goal to start things out will be Gavin McKenna's to seal his MVP-like tournament. Ultimately, this is how I see the medals and the awards going out this year. Overall, I see the gold going to Canada, the silver to Czechia, and the bronze to Sweden. As for best forward, Gavin McKenna out of the 2026 draft, I think is going to sweep that, with the forward, points leader, and MVP going to him. And outside of that, Detroit prospects making a big impact. Axel Sandin-Pellikka being the best defenseman, and the best goaltending, even though the U.S. got eliminated in the quarterfinals, being Trey Augustine, with how dominant he was in the prelims especially. But those are my predictions for the World Juniors this year, and I hope you guys did enjoy. If you agree and disagree, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Who do you see winning the gold medal this year in the World Juniors? I would love your thoughts down below. Who do you think is going to be the ultimate surprise, the big upset? Let me know all your thoughts, and of course, share it with all the hockey fans you guys know online. And of course, hit that like button, hit that subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more World Juniors, more prospect content just like this. And of course, make sure you click on this card for all of my World Juniors talk right in one playlist. Make sure you guys sign up to BetUS using code YouTube150, and I will see you guys in the next one. Have a fantastic hockey day, and goodbye.